Parlez-vous français? No inglés? Were you having trouble understanding me there? Maybe it's because you have a learning disability, or maybe it's a language barrier. In any case, it can be troubling and hard for students to learn, especially if English isn't their native language. But here's the question. How do you know if it's a language barrier or a learning disability? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Today's lesson is it ML or SPED? America is diverse. It has different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds, which is great because that's why they call it a melting pot. It's those unique qualities and differences that make America what it is today, and language is no different. But for a lot of students, it can be a barrier. And for teachers, it can be doubly hard because we don't know if the barrier is the language or a learning disability. So how can we determine it in order to help the student? Well, before we can get into is it a learning disability or is it a language barrier, we have to first understand the differences here and the acronyms. So the first one is MLL. MLL stands for Multilingual Learners, and multilingual learners are students developing proficiency in multiple languages. SPED, or also known as special education, is the process by which students with special needs receive education by addressing their differences while integrating them as much as possible into the typical educational environment of their peers. Now, here's the question. How can you tell the difference? Is it a language barrier or is it a learning disability? Well, the easiest way is to answer this question. Can they understand the lesson in their own language? That's why a lot of schools have interpreters or translators, because if a student doesn't speak the language and they're not understanding the lesson, then yes, technically it is a disability. But here's the key thing. If we can apply a translator or an interpreter in the classroom to help them understand what the teacher's saying and they're able to understand it, then it's not necessarily a learning disability. It's just a language barrier. If they still don't understand the lesson, then maybe it is a learning disability. That's why MLL teachers and SPED teachers work closely together because MLL teachers, they provide accommodations just like SPED teachers do. And many of those accommodations are the same. Not all of them, but many of them. Now, if an MLL teacher is providing those accommodations and the student is still struggling, then it may mean that the student has a learning disability. But what are some things that teachers can do to determine if they do have a learning disability? So, how to determine if it is language or a learning disability? Well, teachers attempting to distinguish between a disability and a language difference should begin by addressing a few key questions. The first one, compared to English, for how long has the child been speaking and exposed to their own home language? Now, for a lot of these students, if they grow up in a household where they only speak Farsi or they only speak Hindi or they only speak Spanish, chances are they're exposed to it a lot, but they're also exposed to English at school. So if that is something that is apparent that the student has only heard Spanish or Farsi or Hindi or French or Russian, then chances are it's not a learning disability because the student is still learning how to speak English. But if they're exposed to both of them and they're still having difficulty, it may be a learning disability. Are the difficulties present in both the child's home language and the new language? And again, we've already covered this before. If the disability still exists, even in their own language, then it's a learning disability. Are the concerns evident in multiple settings? So this kind of ties into the other two. If the student is still having difficulty with their homework, even if it's at home in their native language, or if it's apparent in childcare or with others in their native language, if it's across multiple settings, then it may very well be a learning disability and not necessarily a language barrier. Have developmentally appropriate strategies been delivered systematically? This is a problem for a lot of our students that come from outside the country, because for many of our kids and students that come from outside the country, many of those other countries don't have a systematic approach of helping determine if a child is on par with the rest of their peers. Because from birth all the way up to first grade, there are usually indicators that doctors and teachers look for, and not all countries have the same indicators that we look for. Not all of them are trained to be able to identify these indicators. So it's really hard to determine if these appropriate strategies are being met, especially if they were born outside the country. Have these strategies produced any significant differences in the child's learning and development? Well, again, even if they were born outside the country, we can still apply some of the strategies to help them understand the language. And once they've understood the language, then we can apply some strategies, maybe some accommodations to help them understand the lesson. If they're able to understand it and eventually the barrier of language is no longer there, then they don't have a learning disability. But even after implementing these strategies, if the strategies don't seem to be helping, then the child may have a learning disability. Now, it's very important to know that even though students with learning disabilities and language barriers do exist, the key difference between the two is this: languages can be learned, and eventually that barrier can go away. Learning disabilities, on the other hand, can't. And for those of you who are saying, well, wait a second, I know many individuals with learning disabilities that lead really healthy lives. They're actually in really great jobs. And that's true. But that doesn't mean that the learning disability is no longer present. It's still there. It's just these students, those individuals, have managed to figure out ways around that disability so that they can manage it on their own. Whereas with language, eventually, once they learn the language, then that barrier no longer exists. So think of it this way: language barriers are temporary, learning disabilities are permanent. If you liked what you saw, you learned something new, or you're new to the channel, please click that like button. And if you want updates on future videos, please feel free to click the subscribe button and ring the bell for updates on future videos. And as always, if there's a particular topic in special ed that you would like me to cover, by all means, drop a line in the comments section and I would be happy to help. Because again, this channel is for you and you can help drive what it is that I talk about. So please feel free to comment. And until next time, class dismissed.